Yes,
How are you?
I am fine, Marie Jose. I'm fine. Yeah. So you had what did you have in mind, Marie Jose,
I
for
have in
this?
mind, yeah, I have in mind just to ask you a few questions. People know a little bit in advance what you are about and what the training is all about, and
Hmm.
so they can more easy
Yes.
choose. I have been thinking together with Bert on a few questions to ask you, and shall I just start ahead? Okay, good. Well, um, well, as it is now, as I can see, there are many forms to work with trauma, like somatic experience and other
Hmm.
things, and body work or energetic work or
Hmm.
therapeutic work. And well, how do you see the role of systemic constellations in relation to these other forms? Do you think systemic constellations adds?
Yeah. Just historically speaking, you may remember that in the beginning of this work, trauma wasn't part of the dynamics we were intentionally or consciously addressing. It just didn't exist, so to speak, with one exception, that was the interrupted reaching out movement. That was, the traumatic interruption of mother-child connection. And then you of course have seen Bert working with that, becoming himself the mother and inviting the child to through several steps to reconnect. So that was the only trauma part in constellation work. Second approach is formulated by Franz Ruppert with his idea of finding that trauma causes splits in personalities. And that's very useful. It's very useful to apply that in constellation work and, for example, represent the traumatized, the survival part, and the healthy part person, and then see how they interact. And it's about integration, right? Also, I find it useful to see how a child lives in the illusion that mother built if it really puts effort into it, love it as desired. And so the illusion of love, that's another keyword, very useful to apply that. So I basically use a combination and some own ingredients of these two approaches to respond to trauma, right? So yeah.
Is a transgenerational trauma?
Oh no, that would be too too much expanding the trauma term. A systemic issue is that you're connected unconsciously to another person of your system, be it the same generation or over several generations. So, and that is not necessarily uh, as a trauma. For example, if you're identified with an excluded grandfather, that is perhaps very burdening, if not necessarily traumatic, right? So I think this would be expanding too much the term I said, is transgenerational, no, is, what did you ask? Said, yeah,
Transgenerational trauma. Could we say that any
no,
systemic issue is
no,
that? Is a
no,
transgenerational trauma?
no. Trauma is, I think we should not kind of get into an inflation. That's, by the way, observable now. Trauma is almost everything, and that it gets like a little bit like incest. When that came up and was more in our minds, that and then incest was so much in the foreground that many people, they were in systems, it's not the same, but trauma has right now a tendency to be exaggerated. And one should really reserve it to an overwhelming event that could not be released from the body. Very simple, yeah. And so not every systemic event is traumatic. That's certainly, and I wouldn't subscribe that, no. Mm.
For instance, when you have after, you can feel the same trauma inside your
Yeah,
own
that's
body,
an interesting question, how this transmission happens. Yeah, I think we don't know exactly how that happens. I mean, one thing is that person, when she becomes a mother, this child meets a very disturbed and disruptive mother in her behavior. And her behavior is, of course, informed by the trauma she has experienced. So that is kind of simple to understand. It's an immediate traumatic behavior or traumatizing behavior to the next generation. But if that goes on over several generations, I have a hard time to really explain that well, energetic transmission. One thing that I meet very often and that I'm very interested in is what you can transmit from one generation to another without creating big complicated theory is that the images of those who have been part of the traumatic situation, the images, you see suffering people or killed people or tortured people, these images can really be transmitted from one generation to the other. That basically in the third generation after the event, people have inner images of terrifying events and terrifying or tortured people and so on. So this idea of images being passed on from one generation to the other, of course, fortified with their stories and all this kind of telling or transmitting experiences to the next generation. That is kind of easy to understand why in a third or fourth generation people still are affected by it. If there is another factor like some kind of energy, anonymous energy being transmitted, I don't know. But what helps in trauma therapy when somebody if somebody is affected by traumatic a traumatic condition he has not experienced by himself, what really helps is for me to meet those who have been part of the trauma. Going back and meeting the dead, that is one important issue, how we see in our inner view those who have been part of the trauma. And that is usually an extremely distorted picture. And we have this strange capacity to hold those who have suffered. We can do that over several generations, hold them in the place where they have suffered, not allowing them to move on. Yeah, and that can have a devastating effect on those who live, even after some generations. And that is a very fruitful concept, I would say. It's not more than that, to work with, because then we can invite, as we do in constellation work, invite those who were, burned in the concentration camps or whatever, meet them. And when you really allow them to be there, for them it is not in any way present anymore. They're in a totally different place. And that is very useful, to say the least. Yeah, this working with images of the dead and transforming them, allowing the reality of their present essence to come through. So I cannot fully answer your question. This transgenerational transmission, I think we should admit we really don't know exactly. Does it happen? Oh, yeah, it does. But in which way and what exactly is being transmitted? Yeah. I think based at the end, after some years, it won't be so mysterious. Yes, it won't be so mysterious. I think it will be probably a very simple dynamic to be understood. And but right now we have still to not know. And still we can do something. That's a good thing about it.
Yes.
It's not necessary to understand these dynamics. We can, when coming fully into the present, we can really do meaningful things stepping out of trauma. Yeah. Yes, you may call that like this. Yeah.
Something.
And you know those to whom we think we pay respect by seeing them in their misery, they don't like it. I mean, it's very simple to imagine. You know, I die in a war or something, and then 5 generations later, people come to my grave and cry and say, "Poor you," and so on. Shit, I don't want that. It's not respect, and it's not true. I'm not there any longer. It's very simply speaking, you know. But that's confirmed by constellations. Yeah. In a way, that is perhaps this is a thing that interests me really. That has a collective and even political impact. These issues, you know, how is the people who has been defeated 200 years ago? How do they see their brothers and sisters who were killed by the enemy? They tend to see them in a way that these sisters and brothers 200 years ago, they come and say, "You have to go for justice for us." You know. You see that in the Balkans, that the Serbs, Milosevic and so on, they have widely used that, you know, the images of the Serbs 600 years ago on the Kosovo battlefield. And it's not confirmed by constellation. They're not there anymore. In your name, you cannot go to war. That's not possible. Yeah, and I think that these issues are quite important. You know, the culture of memorizing the dead can be re-traumatizing or healing on a collective level. Yeah, so these issues are neighboring but quite interesting for me. Yeah, by the way, I call constellation work creating your own memorial, and you have the choice that this becomes a good memorial in spite of all the suffering, or a bad one. Yeah? And that can be transferred to the collective level. Yeah, and I think constellation people can contribute something to that level. Yeah. Okay, that was a little excursion.
The field of trauma yet.
How would they take profit of it? Yeah. So for the trauma specialists, I think there's an additional dimension of translating dynamics into, you know, a constellation structure, which makes it much more visible and concrete, and the miracle of representative knowledge that is a big advantage of constellation work is really cannot be overestimated, I think. Yeah. And the trauma people, they can really, as I try to say, translate elements of the trauma dynamics in the constellation structure or in representation. And I think that is an addition to psychotherapeutic effectivity that is really very important. Yeah, and things I find, you know, kind of translating dynamics, but perhaps you have worked just with one person in the individual setting. Now you can translate it into a multi-person situation on the floor and just observe it. Yeah, and the client is in a slightly healthy dissociative state. He observes. He's not in it, and has the freedom to go in and out. So these elements for example, are certainly for a trauma specialist an additional tool that he would certainly love. Yeah. A constellator, again, I think simply what I try to say, that he would get out of the clumsy the clumsy equipment of we have, gained so far in constellation. Where clumsy there are not very many tools to respond to trauma. It's a little clumsy. We have not much options, and there's always the reflex of facing. You just constellate the abusing father, and now daughter has to face it. That still happens, and that is just not appropriate. It is the danger of re-traumatization is still given, and so I think the very differentiated tool case, so to speak, a little technically, of trauma theory and practice is just a big relief. You can relax. You don't have to push. You can allow. For example, let me give one example. When I learned about SE, I understood simply how important it is to take a distance. Do what you could not in the trauma situation, run away. Now you can take a distance, and that means, for example, you can stop the constellation, or you moved chairs, or I remember one client, something had unfolded, and then he turned to me and said, "You know what? I want you to finish the constellation while I am out." And he went out, closed the door, we finished somehow, and sat down, and only then he came in. And that was a big relief, because now, finally, he could go away, not look at this mess, just be for herself, be safe. These simple elements, and playing with them is just a big enrichment that I would recommend any constellator, to have a much easier and, in a good sense, joyful time when it comes to heavy issues. And the client feeling safe, he's being confirmed, no, there's no hurry, we can stop at any time, turn away, look in another direction, leave the room, whatever you want is fine, you are in charge, and we just do step by step and see what unfolds. And then they can have a much easier time to stay, because there's no pressure. So, it's really mutually enriching, and as a constellator, I took enormous profit, and that still happens. I mean, trauma therapy is, in a sense, also in the beginning. Also the neuroscientists will help us to even learn better what kind of, take mindfulness practice. And they found out that this helps integration of the brain, which is the disintegrated, connected, non-connected parts of the brain, is one part of trauma condition. And so, inspiration from that part, how to train your neurological system, that it can better function in a more integrated way. All this will bring us much more relief when so, and we are there. Also, there's just the beginning. Or I just discovered something that I don't know if I talked about in Bernried, self-compassion. So, how do you treat yourself in the midst of difficulties? And how can we be more sensitive to be kind to ourselves in the midst of trauma? Things like that, So there are many directions that will continue to give us very useful things. And I think that the conferences, as far as I see, there's quite some diversity in the trainers, so which is good, right? And I hope there are some creative contradictions between us. But, So that will be certainly a fertile ground for participants to integrate something out of it which is good for them. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Thank you for this sharing. I liked it, and have a good evening.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the latest will be that we meet in
Yeah,
September
same.
at the conference.